Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome from across the world. We do have our American colleagues, we have European colleagues, and we have colleagues in the Middle East. So it's great to be here this afternoon. Just to give you a bit of background for those of you who don't know me, my name's Andy Davis. I'm the owner of a company called Trident Manor, which is a specialist. We look at security, risk, and crisis management. We work with individuals and organisations and help them understand what risks exist, but also how to manage them in a sensible way, especially when crises do happen. My background is, as well as military, I used to be a diplomat, so I spent many years travelling the world, and the last 7 years I've been running Trident Manor, working with great people and enabling the protection of assets, which is what our strapline is. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to share a bit about yourself.
Thank you so much. So it's lovely to see some familiar faces and also some new faces. So I'm Rebecca Attree. I'm the principal of my own firm, Attree & Co. I'm a commercial mediator and also workplace mediator and also a solicitor, but my main role these days is as a mediator. So that is assisting parties to resolve disputes, a whole range of disputes I get involved with. Mostly they're commercial contracts, but also quite often they touch on intellectual property issues. Family business is a particular expertise, workplace, so issues in the workplace, and contentious probate as well. Before I became a mediator, I was a solicitor in the city for many years, and then I had my own practice. And as a solicitor, my main role was drafting and negotiating contracts for businesses selling goods and services internationally. So I've been in the business of helping people to make deals for about the last 25 years. So thank you. Over to you, Andy.
As the title suggests, managing organisational recovery from the pandemic that we faced. Now, the existing crisis, if you'd asked people 6 months ago what their expectations were for the summer of 2020, I'm sure that it wouldn't have featured many of the things that we've had to resort to or plan for in the future. But slowly and surely we're starting to come out of this crisis situation. We do have organisations that have not been able to survive, which is unfortunate. There are those who are going to continue to struggle to survive. But by managing the way in which you as an organisation, you as somebody involved with organisation recovery, takes this forward, will better assist and hopefully help you identify threats that exist, vulnerabilities that may exist, and steer the clearest path out of this pandemic, out of this crisis, and into operational activities, but in a controlled and sensible, pragmatic manner. Now, we've got an hour today, and we're not going to answer all of the questions. Some of the subjects that we're going to cover, we could spend a whole day on, but hopefully what we're going to give you is sufficient information that's going to enable you to start to think a bit more laterally about your organisations, a bit more laterally about the types of threats that exist, but also looking at the changing landscape that this pandemic has brought, because I think it's safe to say for all of us that the business world that we knew beforehand is certainly not going to be the same as the one that is going to emerge going forward. So, just to briefly outline what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about 4 main subjects. And the first one is understanding organisational risks. We're then going to talk about ensuring organisational resilience. Then effective communications and delivery. Before finally, or should I say finally as a subject, talking about establishing a continuous review process. We're trying to keep it as light as we can and enjoyable and interactive as we can. And as Rebecca has said, if anybody has any questions, we've got a part at the end for questions to be received. But if people want to add things on the chat, it'll help flag up questions or points of clarification that people want. So without further ado, I'd like to take forward and look at understanding organisational risk. So before you can understand the risks that your organisation faces, and this is a common factor, irrespective of whether you're in a crisis situation, you first need to understand what needs protecting within your organisation. What are your organisation's assets? Once you understand the organisation's assets, it helps you then understand the source of any risks that might. These are your threats, your hazards. It helps you understand your exposure, which are the vulnerabilities, but also it helps you understand, or it's important that you understand the means of categorizing and the way in which you as an organization want to deal with any risks that you face. So if we look at what are an organization's assets, and just to cover this very quickly, we have tangible assets. So that's your cash, equipment, your product, but it can also include computers, it can include vehicles. You have your intangible assets, trademarks, Coca-Cola, everybody knows that. Your intellectual property, confidential information, operational practices, your strategies, your supply chains, your reputation. All of these things are intangible assets. There are some assets that are more critical than others, and it's important that organizations can actually categorize their assets into levels of importance. Now, the reason for this is the last thing you want to do is spend, especially when you're coming out of a crisis situation, you're trying to recover, is spend a lot of time dealing with things that are really superfluous. They're insignificant in the wider picture. And if you spend time is also money. Is it a worthwhile investment of time and money and effort to actually protect an asset that has very little value? A very simple way is if an organization identifies and categorizes its assets, and I just use a three simple one: ancillary assets. It doesn't really matter whether they're impacted. You can repair, replace, recover them very quickly. Important assets, where there can be a degree of impact, or critical assets, which really mean that they're so vital to your organization and to your activities that if you didn't have them, there is a real risk that you wouldn't be able to function. There's some assets, I think, and irrespective of the roles I've undertaken, that I always view as being critical, and that's people and information. Other people might have, because of the nature of their organization, other critical assets, but certainly from my perspective and looking at my company as a consultancy, it really is people and information, and that's retained information, documented information, etc. If you have assets, who actually knows what assets they have? Assets, and I've put it here, asset register, friend or foe. And the reason I ask that is some people have them, some people don't. I'd just like to launch a quick poll, and if you've got time just to answer this, how many people actually use an asset register? Nearly got. Okay, we've got one person. Right, I'll just end the poll in there. Now that's actually very interesting. So from 11 votes, we have 55%, and I'll just, can everybody see the shared results? Nods, shakes? Great. So 55% use an asset register, 45% don't. Now, every organization I've done audits on or worked with, when I talk about an asset register, the first thing is that the chief financial officer says, this is our asset register, this is what we have. That's great, but are they all of the organizational assets? So I now have another question, and let me just, I'm going to ask a second question. Out of those of you who actually have asset registers, how many of you actually record your intangible assets? Now, the reason I ask this is because, as I said, most asset registers are within the realms of finance officers and the commercial teams. And that's interesting, Paul. So I'll just share the results there. We had 4 people that responded. 1, yes, they record intangible. 3, they don't. And that's in line with expectations. I'll just stop the sharing results. If you categorize your assets, you know which is a value, which is important. Now, when you're looking at risk and crisis management situations, your intangible assets could have a far more significance and far more important intrinsic value than your tangible ones. And when we're looking at and considering crisis management and recovery from that, we really have to consider both tangible and intangible and categorize and prioritize those assets that are critical to our organization. So moving on, if we know what we're protecting within our organization, what's the threat sources? What's the threat? A very broad meaning is any factors which include actions, circumstances, or events which have the potential to cause loss, harm, or damage. And the easy way to remember things is, and some people do get this confused, it's the threat or the hazard is the source of a risk, not the other way around. Now here, general threats that we face, obviously we can't go away from pandemics, disease, which we're all living through at the moment, but also climate environment. Yes, when you talk about threats, people will think of crime, terrorism, warfare. They do all exist. But there are threats are much to organizations are much broader and can include data losses of breach, loss of reputation, damage to reputation, attacks to reputation. All of these things are threats to organizations. If we look at what vulnerabilities are, being in the middle of a desert, with a backpack, I'm just looking at the footwear, I don't know whether they're sturdy enough. What are the vulnerabilities? Easy way to remember it from an organizational point of view is a vulnerability is the exposure that the organization has or the asset has to any threats or hazards. And this is generally caused by either an inability to identify the threats or to actually prevent the threats from impacting the organization or the assets in the first instance. We have to remember is that vulnerabilities and the concept is very relative, very dynamic. Just to give you a couple of examples of vulnerabilities, if we don't develop a vaccine against COVID-19, we are going to continue to be vulnerable from its effect. Likewise, if we leave the front door open of our house, we're vulnerable to a burglary. Other factors will come into play, but that's a vulnerability. So we understand the threat, we understand the exposure. What is a risk? And if we take the international standards, it's an effective uncertainty on objectives. That's ISO 31000. In simplest terms, a risk is the likelihood, it's combining the likelihood of an event occurring and the consequences and impact of that actually happen. You know, my thoughts, and I have been talking for many years on this, risk isn't tangible. It's fluid in nature, specific to individuals, organizations, and operations. And, you know, so you can't say this is the risk against all of these types of organizations or against all of these types of premises. And the way that we actually measure risk is by conducting assessments. In its simplest terms, it's the multiplication of the likelihood versus the consequences. One thing I'll say about risk is each organization or even individuals have different risk tolerance levels. And that could be, based on the sector. It could be based on the risk appetite of the organisations. What I would say, when you're assessing and measuring risk, it's vital that within an organisation, the same matrix are used, i.e. the same descriptions for low, medium, high, or for critical, non-critical, or ancillary. And that way, you prevent malinterpretations of the meaning. If it's documented, then everybody can follow that documentation and everybody can work towards that, which means the risk assessments that are undertaken are far more likely to be accurate. Just to illustrate this is a simple chart that shows consequences on the left side and probability of occurrence, or the likelihood. And so if we go consequences 3, likelihood is 5, and when we come up there, we see that it's a medium severity risk. If it went into the higher areas, one thing I would say, whenever you, whatever format you use, it's great having the colours. What do they mean? In my situation, and certainly the situation when I advise clients, anything in the red, let's deal with it immediately. And then you actually go down to the point where if you use a 5x5 system in the blue, as and when, if need be, or you just accept the risk. So looking at that as the basis of organisations, the threats that can exist, the vulnerabilities that they could be exposed to, and how to actually identify the risks. Let's look at identifying future risks to organisational assets, or even to organisations themselves. What can sink your ship? When we're in a crisis situation and we're considering recover, remember is no two organisations are the same. So we have colleagues who are in the USA, we have colleagues who are in Egypt. You might have two similar companies doing two similar things, but the social impacts, the climatic impacts, everything else can actually play on the level of risk that your organisation faces in that situation. Some things that I would ask you to consider internal factors, those that you control, but also consider the external factors. So for example, where is your organisation providing services? What type of services are being provided? What's your organisation's location? What staff do you need? Where are your supply routes? What are your access routes to ensure productivity or to deal with clients? Obviously, understanding what your risk tolerance and acceptance levels are. These are simple things to remember, because all of these things can actually impact the level of risk that your organisation faces. One of the things in the security world, we deal with adversarial risks. And what's interesting, in a crisis situation, adversarial risks tend to actually come further down the line because they are there. They're always constant: crime, terrorism. However, you have to be careful, because when you're considering the impact, you've got to also consider the external factor, in this case COVID. Has that actually caused an increase of crime due to unemployment? Is it specific to the area of operation? Has workplace violence increased because of redundancy, because of stress? Have fraudulent activities increased because people are trying to sell PPE to people? A whole host of things, which the threat, the adversarial threat hasn't changed, but the causation of that threat or the impacts on that may have. You must look at the threats to your own organisational assets, and don't worry about somebody else's assets. Worry about your own assets. How are you going to protect your own assets? Because that's what matters. It's no good somebody in a similar business saying, this is what I'm doing. Their circumstances might differ greatly to yours. Understand what your critical assets are and take steps to protect them. Now, obviously, with threats and with recovery, we've got to look at the threat considerations. And we're not looking at nuclear threats. COVID hasn't brought that yet. But what we are looking at is things like staff. How has the COVID pandemic actually impacted your staff? What about their well-being? What about travelling to and from the office and recovery and resumption of activities? What's needed to ensure office safety? What if, like me, and certainly if I look at Carla, we travel an awful lot. How is that going to impact our ability to work and to still actually travel? Or even if we send in staff. Got to look at our capabilities. Are we able to work? Is the situation as we're recovering from a crisis limited our abilities and caused us to actually consider new ways of working? What about our supply routes? What about our information security? What capacity do we have? Are we able to return back to normal? So we have an office here for 6 to 8 people. We can safely fit 4 people in, but we've started our recovery by bringing people in and keeping people working at home. We have to consider our operations, the delivery of our goods and services. I can't travel the world, so it means that my travel restrictions mean I either have to adapt or put things on hold. What about our supply chains? Our supply chains which could actually be people as well as goods. Our supply chains out, how we provide them services. Are there backlogs on critical equipment? Are we able to get our product to the clients in time? I'll mention it here because our operations include our procedures. Are they relevant, legal, and effective still? These are things we have to consider. Moving on, solvency. Are we solvent? Are we sufficiently solvent to see ourselves out of this crisis, or do we need to look at our reserves? Are we able to assess our income against our outgoings? What about debt? Client non-payment? These things we need to consider because we can't go back to the way it was. Things have changed. People do not have the money, or they may be late in paying the money. So all of these things can impact your operational effectiveness and your recovery. And reputation. Has anything happened that has directly impacted your company or your organization's reputation? Has anything impacted clients where negative reputation incidents have occurred, and that could by default impact yourself? Considering your reputation is important, and that means never overstretching yourself in the recovery phase. I've certainly had people approach me and say, we can do this, this, and this for you. And actually, when you start asking them important questions about how are you going to travel there, how are you going to move from point A to point B, you realize that if you'd accepted that, they would not have been able to deliver. That would have directly or indirectly impacted my company's reputation. What I'd like to then do is hand over to Rebecca to talk about legal aspects.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. I see that legal is on the nuclear threat slide. When I was in private practice, I was sometimes called the secret weapon when I was a solicitor. Hopefully, legal isn't always about that. Okay, so legal issues. What are the main things about the legal issues in COVID-19 and the current pandemic? Well, the basic premise is that if you enter into a contract, you are legally obliged to do what you have agreed to do. And if you fail to fulfill your obligation, then you could have a potential liability to the other party for breach of that contract. But there's a number of things that you can look at in the current situation, and I'd like to just run through those very quickly. So let's just, while we're looking at the technology, just think about getting paid. That's a current problem at the moment for a lot of people. A lot of companies have cash flow issues. So these are the topics here: getting paid, suspending obligations. You know, can you say, look, I can't do it right now, but I hope to be able to do so shortly. Terminating contracts. Do you want to just walk away from the contract totally? And then I promised a few words about the F words, which for lawyers are force majeure and frustration. And then a thought about supervening illegality. What if something becomes illegal according to regulations made by government because of the pandemic? And then can we reach to our insurance policy? Is there some help there? And if we can't do any of those things, what about some online dispute resolution? So let's just look at the first topic of getting paid. So as I was just beginning to say, perhaps coming to an agreement with somebody that you would delay demanding payment, you would allow perhaps a payment delay. Really important that when you do that, you don't effectively wave goodbye to your rights, because English law has a principle that if you forbear, if you give forbearance and you waive, you can't subsequently enforce them. So what you should do is to say, on this occasion, we agree that you can pay 28 days late or whatever it may be. Make it clear whatever your position is on interest, because it may be that there's interest outstanding as well. So you need to make it clear not only that it's okay for them to pay late, but is interest still carrying on accruing? So what about saying, actually, I'm the one that's got to perform and I can't do this, I need to suspend my obligations? Well, the best thing is trying to get consensual agreement on this. So getting around a table and having a conversation, or getting around a metaphoric Zoom table like we are here, to say, look, we can't perform, we need more time, can we please have more time? Now, the important thing is that actually, if you are on the receiving end of somebody having that conversation with you, in law, you are under a duty to what is called mitigate your loss. So if they are putting something on you, if actually you could solve the problem another way, you're actually under a duty to go and do that within reason. You can't go off and spend an absolute fortune and say, look, this is what it's cost me, now I'm going to ask for that recompense back from you. But you can do so to a reasonable level, and you can be recompensed at a reasonable level. So if you can't get the raw materials from one supplier, for example, but you could get them from somewhere else, then that is something that you're actually under a duty to do. And keep a record of the fact that you've done it, because should it go to a court later, if you can show that evidence, you will be on stronger ground. But if actually you say, do you know what, I've had enough of this, and I actually just want to terminate this contract, then don't just think you can get out of a contract because you want to. Getting into a commercial contract is a bit like getting married. You can't get out of it for a tiny reason. Just like you can't have a divorce because somebody doesn't change their socks regularly enough, you cannot terminate a contract for a minor breach. Normally it needs to be a key term, or it needs to be specified in the contract. So don't just go willy-nilly terminating contracts. In many of my mediations, I see that people terminate a contract. Maybe they have a claim for £1 million against the other company, and the other company then counterclaims against that party for 2 million. And the counterclaim is, you have wrongfully terminated that contract. And because you wrongfully terminated it, I've had a whole fallout of problems. The dominoes have all fallen over in my business. Now, if you are going to terminate and you decide that you are entitled, make sure that you do it properly. Most contracts have quite specific terms about giving notice. And are you able actually to give notice by email, or does it need to be a hard copy? Bear in mind that the English postal rule, which is something that pervades all contracts unless you override it, says that a notice is served when the notice is put in the letterbox. So who knows right now who out there might be posting letters to me, potentially serving notices on various parties, and how do I know what's going in the letterbox? So have a look at your contract, make sure that you serve the notice in accordance with it. So let's move on to the F words, force majeure. This is something that a lot of people are talking about right now. There's a whole lot of activity looking at these clauses. And perhaps, Andy, while we're moving on to the next slide, could I invite you please just to launch our poll? This is anonymous, by the way, so we don't know who's answering what. And the question is, how many of you have actively negotiated or considered a force majeure clause in the last 12 months? So have you looked at this? Now, in my experience, when I was in solicitors' offices, nobody looked at force majeure. It was at the back end of the contract, and most people, frankly, were, falling asleep by the time they got to clause 99. Interesting that the results are coming in. The majority of you haven't actually actively looked at it, but there are some people who have. Let's just share those results. So it's about 60% who haven't looked at the clause, about 40% have. So it may be that you've been looking at it more recently. I think if I ran that poll a year ago, I think the majority would have said no. So let's just think a little bit about this force majeure clause. What is it? Well, force majeure doesn't actually have any meaning in English law. It's just a very generic term. So you need to look at what does the clause actually say. If it just says it's any supervening event, not within the control of the parties, that affects the performance of the contract, usually it's an unforeseen event, probably that would cover anything that COVID-19 is preventing you from doing, subject to a timing issue that I'll come on to, because the point is, it's all about what was foreseen. So if you've got a contract that was entered into after we all knew about COVID, probably force majeure won't help you. Now, when did we all know about COVID? And of course, now we're hearing that potentially it was around sooner than we thought. But I think at the moment, most people are saying it's after the time of when developments in the Wuhan province were beginning to be reported in the international media, so January of this year. So then we need to look at what does the clause actually say. Do we have a list of things that it covers? So generally it's things like earthquake, tsunami, strikes possibly. Well, if it's got a list and then a pandemic isn't in it, then it wouldn't be covering COVID-19. But if it has the magic words of including but not limited to the following things, then that would mean that probably you could cover anything that's caused by COVID-19, because that is a more broad list that is covering similar things as well. And sometimes, even if the list is definitive, it's worth having a look at the beginning of the contract, because many contracts have a little clause at the beginning that says interpretation, and it says anything referred to in this contract is deemed to include similar things. That you never particularly focused on that clause, but that's something that really helps the draftsperson, because it means I don't have to actually think of absolutely everything I want to list here. It's able to cover other things that are within the similar generic category. So if you're within force majeure, what can you do? Well, you need to look at the force majeure clause. Often it says it gives a right to termination. But in my experience, increasingly, what I'm seeing in international trade mediations, particularly large contracts, the force majeure clause says you've got a right to suspend. And any of you familiar with the Vienna Convention will know that those are the principles of that, which is an international trade convention. So basically, you're entitled to suspend the obligations. So if you're the one performing, you don't have to do anything while this is going on. But equally, the obligation of the paying party is also suspended as well. So it's worth looking at what is going on with force majeure. The other thing about force majeure is, does it require notice to be served? So that takes me back to those issues of, have you served that notice validly and correctly? So moving on to the next slide, which is the other F word, frustration. Yeah, I bet many of us have sensed frustration in the last few weeks. It is also a legal term as well as a state of mind. Basically, if there isn't a force majeure clause, then you're left to the mercy of the English common law if the contract is under English law. And we have this principle under English common law that says a contract can be void, so you tear it up, on the ground of frustration when something happens after it's been entered into which renders it physically or commercially impossible to fulfill the contract as originally envisaged. Now you might think, oh, well, that's simple, isn't it? COVID-19 clearly has done that. But actually, the cases on frustration have been very few, and generally it's seen to be a really heavy burden to prove. And so actually we haven't had any cases, to my knowledge, on frustration as a result of this pandemic, and generally they don't succeed well. So the only other thing you might have in your back pocket in terms of a solution here, if you don't have a force majeure clause, is there a supervening English law illegality? So can you say that there's a piece of legislation that makes what you are doing or needing to do under the contract prohibited? Just hindering the performance isn't enough. It can't just be that it's inconvenient or it's difficult. It's actually got to be illegal. Now, to my knowledge, the government guidance often is called regulations. At the moment, with regard to the pandemic, we haven't actually had anything that has said it's illegal to do something. But for example, in Italy, and pleased to welcome some Italians here today, actually Italy has, for example, made legislation which self-proclaim that doing certain things is actually prohibited and it's mandatory. So anyone else coming into the country, into Italy and doing it would be causing an illegal act. So a couple of things to help you, in addition to the bad news there. One is, do you want to reach to your insurance contract? Do you have business interruption cover? A lot of activity in relation to people looking at those clauses, and I think very helpfully, there is a test case being brought by the Financial Conduct Authority on behalf of 8 insurers, and it's going to happen next month. We're expecting the outcome to be published in the second half of July. Basically, a representative sample of 17 policy wording used by at least 16 insurers is going to be tested in the High Court to decide which of these clauses will actually cover which situations. So watch this space on that. But if actually you think all of this is rather too much, actually I just want to sort this out, think about an online dispute resolution and using mediation. This is where I spend a lot of my time, basically spending a day or a few hours now offering this on Zoom, where parties can get together and find a deal that works for them. And it's not just about the law, it's about the commercial considerations, it's about the timing. Let's get an outcome right now. We don't want to wait. If you try and bring a case right now before the High Court, you could be waiting up to 2 years. That's the backlog. So, you know, a bird in the hand is maybe worth, 2 in the bush, and thinking about that. But I think it's time to pass on now to Andy, please, for some further comments.
Thanks, Rebecca. And what I'd like to talk about is ensuring organisational resilience. What really is important is that following a crisis, organisations are able to recover. But the most important thing is having the resilience to recover and a degree of robustness. And really, I can't stress the importance of governance. Helps your organizational governance helps you create resilience. So policies, practices, procedures, all of these really do play a vital part in controlling and managing the risks that you face. Your operational practices, what we need to do is how are we operating? Are they still fit for purpose? Are there ways in which we can do things differently than what we did before? Are there ways in which we can actually do things more effectively? And if we look and examine all of these things, we are ensuring our organisation's resilience and robustness. What about our staffing levels? How many staff do we have? How many staff do we need? Where do we need them? And them words again, do they remain fit for purpose? And future-proofing, lessons learned. Where are we going? Are we still able to deliver the services? Do we need to scale them back? And if we're able to look at what we've delivered, how we've delivered, and identify the positive ways going forward, it's going to increase that resilience that we have as an organisation and increase the robustness from the risks we face. This picture, welfare and mental well-being. People often forget about those who've been actively engaged in crisis management, but the stress and trauma that they are under, the pressure that they are under, when businesses do resume, all of a sudden it's just like, okay, we're back to normal. Well, actually, who's considering the welfare and mental well-being of these individuals who have worked so tirelessly to get the organisation through the crisis situation? And the idea there is that obviously what we want to do when we come through, when we introduce processes, when we identify ways of being resilient and increase robustness, the organisation can grow. And from that first little shoot of recovery, we're able to grow and expand, not just financially, but obviously operationally, and strengthen our organisational resolve. We'll just move on, and we're coming on to one of the important aspects of the presentation. That's effective communication. What I would just like to point out before I hand over to Rebecca is that in a crisis situation, those organisations that fail to communicate effectively to internal and external audiences make mistakes and suffer. Elon Musk, he's multi-billionaire. He did an own goal. One, when he got into a Twitter spat with some cave rescuers, and in doing so, $2 billion was wiped off the value of the company. 1st of May this year, he actually said that his company's stock price was too high. It caused a drop of 12,000. So financially, that communication, that poor communication, has actually led to his organisation suffering. I did read today that it's now over $1,000 a share. Well, good luck for those people who've got the shares in that at the moment. President Trump, he delivers an awful lot of messages. How many are actually effective? What I would say is that great examples of effective crisis communications, and this, when it is delivered correctly, it provides clarity, it provides confidence, it provides a great deal of assurance to those within the organisation or even in the country. Prime Minister Ardern in New Zealand, she gave her communications during the COVID response measured, calm, accurate, and actually it was very, very well recorded. Even more so was when she was given one of these talks about giving the updates on the COVID situation, and there was an earthquake. Cool as a cucumber, she didn't panic. She continued to deliver the message, which again spoke volumes of her handling in a crisis situation. What I'd like to do now is to hand over to Rebecca to continue.
Thank you so much, Andy. As you have said, mental health is so important, and particularly in these challenging times. And effective communication is important because poor communication can impact on the mental health of people and how they receive messages. And one of the most important things is it's not just what you say, but how you say it. And I'd just like to play a few bars of one of my favourite songs here. All lies and jest, still a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. Just think of that when you're speaking, because people do only hear what they want to hear and they do disregard the rest. So it's really important that you prepare well, that you have good timing, you think about your opening, you listen well, you find a solution, and you end well. So just here, what I'd like to do is just to think for a moment and ask a poll of what kind of communications have you had with other people in your organisations? Have you taken or proposed to take any or all of the following action in relation to staff? So you can tick any of those. By the way, furlough, that closed yesterday. If you wanted to furlough people, you should have done that by close yesterday. And while you're answering the poll, I'm just going to play a few bars from another song. So thank you very much indeed for answering the poll. That's interesting. I'd like to share the results here. So everybody has had to take steps with regard to furlough, none redundancy. That's good news. That may of course be in the pipeline. Reduced pay 20%, reduced hours none. Again, that may be coming forward. Negotiate when to take holiday. 40%, a lot of that has been, of course, consensual. So just a few words to give you a flavour of how to communicate well if you're going to be having to have any of these difficult conversations. Preparing well is important. Failing to prepare is to prepare to fail. So establish a timeline in terms of what it is that you're going to talk about, and try to get all your ideas on one A4 sheet. Get it up, that Word document on your screen if you're having a conversation online with somebody, so you've got your thoughts already prepared. But in addition to preparing analytically, prepare emotionally as well. Think about where are you coming from, but also where are the other people coming from. It's that I'm okay, you're okay psychological approach. You know, remember that they're a positive human being, and they've got their own thoughts as well. Think about the worst case. What could they say back to you? It's what in our mediation trade is called an accusation audit. You know, imagine the things that they can say back to you and anticipate how you will respond to that. And of course, make sure you're on firm ground on the law. Make sure you know what the legal position is as well. So then when it comes to timing, don't go for a Friday. A Friday is bad news. If you're going to have a difficult conversation, the person is going to be left brewing and stewing on that for the weekend. Generally, it's thought that Tuesday is the best day. So make sure that you think about that. Try to set the agenda carefully. Say to the person you want to have a meeting or write to them, and try to give a little bit of an idea of the agenda. But be careful on that, because you know, I've heard of situations where people have said, there's going to be a pay reduction. That's what we want to get on the line about with you. But when they get on, actually, the pay reduction is tiny, and there are much bigger things. And the person has been really fearful about negotiating the pay reduction when actually there were a lot of other things. So it may even be worth saying what isn't on the table as well. As with all things, the opening is really important. It sets the scene. It's going to be harder online because there's no comfy chair, no cup of tea, no biscuits. Be aware of the other person and what's going on in their lives. Do they have other people that they're caring for? What are their pressures on them? If you're from the point of view of the employer and you're speaking as an employer or somebody in authority, think perhaps to dress down a little. And have a calm tone, because you're already in a position of authority. So coming in you know, suited and booted is probably not what necessary. Agree how long you're going to speak for, and ask for permission to speak even when you come on the call, and to say, you know, there may be some dark moments in this conversation. Do I have permission to talk with you about this for the next 30 minutes or whatever it may be? If it's a large group, get some rules of engagement. Mute everybody, agree whether people are going to have their videos on or not. I heard of a company recently who were bringing staff back to work, and they didn't do that. And one person just dominated the Zoom call by saying, I've put on too much weight during furlough and I can't get into my uniform. You know, and everybody else's issues were not dealt with in time. Try to move the conversation from saying I and you to be saying we. The more you say we, the more you're going to be getting buy-in from that other person. And then paint a picture, but go for it. Get the bad news in early. I know it's tricky, and many of us would rather, delay the agony, but actually the sooner you've said the message, the sooner you can talk about it. The other person's expecting it. So it's much better just to go for it and say what it is that you need to say. But in addition to saying, of course, you also need to listen well, and you need to be listening to where the other person is coming from. So one of the things on Zoom is if you go, aha, suddenly the video will come to you, and that will almost be like an interruption. So try to perfect active listening skills on Zoom that don't involve noise. So that can be nodding or smiling or just doing some facial expressions that are encouraging. Be aware that whatever it is you're sharing with this person, they are probably going to have to go and say to others the message, their family members, colleagues. So perhaps help them to formulate the message and the reasons they will give as to why things are changing or whatever it is. What if things go to hot conflict? Well, let the person vent within reason, and then hopefully you've got your accusation audit there as well. It may be that you need to look to find a solution, try to be creative, try to look at problem solving. Remember that both parties are not going to be super happy. So don't set your expectations too high. I always say as a mediator, if I'm administering anaesthetic in equal measures in both rooms, I'm doing my job okay. And then make sure that you end well. Make sure that you come to a solution. They are left feeling a valuable human being. They may not be 100% okay with the answer, but once it's reached, frankly, shut up and get off the call, which is why I'm now going to pass over to Andy, because I see time's ticking.
Thanks, Rebecca. The very quick slide, but continuous review during recovery stages. As explained, we're in a dynamic situation. Things are going to be constantly changing, laws are going to be changing, guidance, rules, the area in which we operate or can operate. Look at what's happened in the past. That's what's the dinosaur in the mirror, but also look ahead. Look ahead to where you want and you expect your organization to be in 1, 2, 3 months' time. It's totally inappropriate to look a year in advance or in any detail a year in advance because things are so dynamic at the moment. But make sure that your policies, your practices, your guidelines and procedures are sufficient, they're robust and fit for purpose. And one of the things I will always say during the recovery stage is be very, very mindful of your duty of care. That's the duty of care to your staff, and that's moral as well as legal aspects, because it is vitally important that coming out of and recovering from a crisis situation, that your team is there, your team is able to function, and your team is able to take things forward. So just to summarize, we've had an hour. It's gone by very, very quickly. I'm sure we could have talked for 3 or 4 hours, gone into a lot more detail. But to summarize, from the security and from the risk management side, we are in uncharted territories. But knowing and understanding what you have to protect, what threats exist, and taking proactive steps to manage the risks that you're faced with. Being mindful of what's in the future, being mindful of the fluid situation. You should then be able to manage and mitigate many of the threats and risks that you and your organisations and your staff may face in the future.
Thanks, Andy. And I think from the legal aspect, the law is a moving topic and it adjusts according to circumstances. And if you're entering into a new contract right now, be aware that issues such as force majeure will have a different interpretation right now, because the events of the pandemic are now known to us. So you need to specifically agree what your let out might be if you can't actually perform it. But at the end of the day, there's the law there, but I think commercially it's a question of assessing risks and getting around a negotiation table and agreeing pragmatic ways of going forward. And certainly on the employment and workplace point of view, I think there's a lot that could be done with the effective communication techniques that are used as a workplace mediator to negotiate with employees who are coming back to work. So I think it's super important that people who are coming back to work actually feel that what's happening is fair, and that conversations are done in a way that they feel that their circumstances are being taken into account. So I'm seeing an increase in inquiries and uptake with regard to using workplace mediation as a tool to bring people back to work in a way that suits the company and the people.